Hello, this is Patrick Daly and welcome to Interlinks. Interlinks is a programme about globalisation and the effects it has had on Ireland and other countries around the world over the last 50 years or so. In each programme, we interview a person from another country or with strong connections to another country to get their unique perspective on globalisation as it has affected them, the country they live in and its relationship with the wider world. There's a little bit of history, a dash of economics, a sprinkling of business and an overlay of personal experience, both from me and from my interviewees from around the world. In recent programmes, we've travelled back and forth across the Atlantic from Europe to the Americas several times, talking to consultants, academics, diplomats and business people. Today, we will be talking to an Irish businessman, but an Irish businessman with a very international outlook, a man who is a serial entrepreneur with very diverse business and personal interests. He's a businessman described by the Irish Times as one of the most unorthodox and successful businessmen operating in Ireland today. The man I'm talking about is John Teeling. In his career, John has been an academic, an explorer and a whiskey distiller. He lectured in business and finance at UCD for 20 years. He's been associated with many businesses in mineral exploration all around the world in Sierra Leone, Iran, Botswana and Jordan. Companies such as Petrel, Botswana Diamonds and now the 162 Group. In the 1980s, he set up the Cooley Distillery, which he sold to Jim Beam in 2011. And his latest whiskey venture is the Dundalk-based Great Northern Distillery. I'm delighted to have John join us on the line to talk about his experiences and reflections on doing business internationally from Ireland and to get his perspective on the future for Ireland in this globalised world. Welcome, John, and thank you very much for being here with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
John, would you be able to tell me a little bit about your career start? How did this all start? I read that you studied at UCD and you lectured at UCD. So when and how did the business thing come in?
Well, UCD was only the start of it. I went, after I finished a master's in UCD, I went to University of Pennsylvania at the Wharton School and did an MBA in finance there. Came back to UCD and then went back to Harvard where I did a doctorate, which took a long time in finance. But while I was there, I worked as consultant for the Irish mining industry, which during the 70s became totally international. And also I wrote the case studies and did the initial work on what would eventually lead to the establishment of the Cooley Distilleries. So from a very early age, literally from the time I was finished, I was educated internationally. My initial work, apart from the university, was all in international companies. And between, say, 75 and maybe 85, I was involved in establishing a small number of companies that worked internationally. But Ireland is so small; if you're not international, you're not anything. Yeah,
and in those years, 75 to 85, those were kind of my teenage years, and I remember economically, though, some of those years were quite bleak here at home, weren't they? So
that was the part of the problem. Yeah. The mining industry, which had blossomed in the 60s and the early 70s, went into a fallow period because of licensing difficulties and title difficulties and prices. So we ended up going to where the minerals were. We established a couple of small Irish companies and went abroad. I was at that stage involved in financial trading on listed companies, so I got involved in a number of textile companies. And for them to grow, they had to develop internationally. That was a difficult ask because labour costs were too high in Ireland. But I have always, I think, since the BCom days of the early 60s, I have been interested and realised, I think, that the future of Ireland lay internationally.
And when you went international in those days, what kind of challenges did you come up against, say, cultural, linguistic, technical and so on?
All of those and more, and they continue to be there. You on the mineral side, you have title difficulties and you're dealing with the different languages and the different cultures and indeed very different cultures where people expect to be paid the whole time for things like that. In terms of selling products, what we have traditionally, well, maybe not traditionally, but what we have done in the last number of years is we seek local partners, knowledgeable partners who will guide us through the morass. And if it involves setting up a local company, they will be shareholders in that company. And the more companies, the more work we've done internationally, the more I believe in this in this process. So that you will always have somebody who can do it. Because with the best will in the world, even going into the UK and the US, you are culturally naive.
Yeah.
And you just make mistakes. And these guys can help you avoid the worst of it. You still make awful mistakes. Even when you're very experienced, you make bad mistakes. You don't do the right things. You say the wrong thing. But that's the nature of the business. And
when you talk about local partners, are you talking about some form of arm's length strategic partnership? Are you talking actually about joint ventures?
Well, they would be almost entirely joint ventures. On our mineral side, this is exploration, oil and gas and minerals. We've done about 30 joint ventures over about 30 years, where you would bring in a local and indeed international partners who would have the strength to be able to do the necessary work, either technical or geological or local. On terms of the more commercial products, consumer type products, you want somebody usually with access to markets and can bring you through the regulations if necessary. I'm not averse to sharing equity at all.
Mm-hmm. And I guess when you're doing a joint venture, I've had some experience of this, trying to help a client build a joint venture with a Spanish company, and it can be quite a lot of challenges because people are putting their risk and their money together and having to trust the other partner to a quite considerable degree. Is that so?
Well, it's true. But if you look at a view, and this is probably still naive after 50 years of doing this. If you're going to grow in a country, you're going to have to trust somebody.
Yeah.
And so if you have, if the country has a rule of law, and an awful lot of them don't, and if they have regulations, companies, acts, and various things like that, and you establish something, you are still going to run into problems. Your contract is important. In fact, as you speak to me today, I am trying to finalize a contract with an American company, and there's goodwill on both sides. Mm-hmm. But this has been very difficult because the American lawyers representing this American company are determined to earn their dollars, so they keep raising issues,
sure.
Which means I have to raise them with the Irish one. And when you do need a working document, and probably internationally more important than even in Ireland, you must remember that the contract is for the divorce, not for the marriage.
Yeah.
And when things are going well, you don't have problems. It's when there are problems that you really need to see the small print in your contracts. And that can happen for a variety of reasons. And actually, I have to say, will happen over time. And you just have to deal with it. But if your future lies in these markets, if that's where the market is, that's where you've got to be.
Yeah. Do I detect that it's the Americans are bringing up the legal details? You would be happy to move forward with a simpler contract and more of a trust type arrangement? Is that your default?
No, I wouldn't say that.
No.
We are at this stage now. We would have standard contracts,
yeah,
which are quite long and complicated. It's the technical difficulties of lawyers who don't understand the legalities of whiskey. You know, the different things like OLAs and LPAs and regauge litres of pure alcohol, original litres, you know. So there's a learning experience. But then American lawyers can be very tetchy. And so too can Irish ones.
Yeah.
And I picked the American because you would say, well, that's an easy country to do business with. Relying on kind of your network of contacts, for instance, in Europe, if you get into a distribution agreement, they are extremely difficult to get out of.
Yeah,
I'm sure you have found that.
Yeah.
France is appalling.
Yeah,
and so while you want to be very careful, you really can't wait forever until the best partner comes along. You may just have to take what's available to you. If you're a small player, as we tend to be.
Yeah. And I guess you've got to accept that level of risk, and you've got to accept that mistakes will be made, and you've got to take them on the chin and just move on, isn't it?
Try and minimise them as much as possible. Yeah. And in general, over the years, I think I've been happy enough. I mean, most business people are trying to do well. Not everybody sets out to take advantage of you or
sure.
to screw you or to run away with it. Now, success in itself can be a problem, even more so in minerals, and maybe in commercially too. If you suddenly have a business where you have the majority shares and it's suddenly doing very well, the local guy can say, well, look, I'm doing all the work and they're making all the money.
Yeah.
That's going to happen, and they need renegotiation, and then the country may not be happy with you for doing various things. But that's the nature of our business. That's what's going to happen.
Do you have any funny cultural anecdotes from the years of doing business?
I haven't thought about it. I'm sure there are many of them. But in general, over the years, even in some exotic locations in Central Africa or in South America, I haven't done that much in Asia yet. I tend to say that, we're working, you meet in hotels, the people we tend to be work with may not be the poor locals.
Yeah, sure.
And many of them are US educated. So we've something in common. There's just one I was dealing with in the last couple of hours, in fact, who turned out to be an American Harvard MBA and a Cambridge graduate, and my partner is both of those.
Yeah.
So, the two of them could talk to each other all day long.
About their alma mater, yeah?
Absolutely. Yeah. Alma maters.
Yeah, correct.
So, yeah, I'm bad on that, but I mean, you just get on with it, you do it, and,
sure.
and I struggle. I'm not a great one for... I struggle with local foods, and because I don't drink, I really struggle with that. That if you meet in some of the Asian countries where
it's kind of expected,
a lot of drink and a lot of vodka.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't. But you know what? It's just probably the worst events I've had were in France and the UK, where the UK chairman said, "I don't trust a man who doesn't drink," which was the end of that joint. And
particularly an Irish man who doesn't drink, yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, the company afterwards went bust. I think that's quite.
Yeah,
And the second one was a French one, where very keen to be our distributor in France. And we went through the various meetings with the board, went to have lunch, and they had red wine and white wine and dessert wine and sweet wines and all kinds of things. And I was drinking, at least I had enough sense not to order Coca-Cola, which would have really had me thrown out of the door. I had water. On the way back, there was lots of murmurings. On the way back to the airport, the guy with me he said, "What do you think?" I said, "Didn't think of that that well." He said, "Didn't go well at all." They said that was the first time since 1775 there was a non-drinker in the boardroom. Didn't get that deal either.
There you go. So the Teeling name now is very much associated with whiskey. So how far back does that association go?
There was a Teeling family had a distillery in Marrowbone Lane, set up by Walter, who lived in the centre of the city in 1782, taken over by his son John in 1791, and sold to Nicholas Rowe in 1803. Now, I thought that was one of the many small distilleries that were around at the time.
And are those Teelings related to you? Are they your ancestors?
They're not that close, because we ended up in I'm Northside Dublin, but we claim them as ancestors anyway. They'll have the same DNA. I have a cousin who does all of this, who tells me that
Ancestry.com and all of that.
Yeah, well, this fella has it all, and he told me he was in over the weekend. He says he's 39% shares your DNA, so he's a cousin. It's wonderful that you can do this nowadays. And so that was sold, and there was nothing happened then till 1986. The reports or the proposal was written in 1971, but lack of money and various other things meant that nothing happened until 86.
Mm-hmm. And then you, in the 80s, you set up Cooley Distillery, is that correct?
Yeah, I always wanted to do it. I thought at that stage there was a monopoly in Irish whiskey, and where there are monopolies, there's inefficiencies. And the monopoly, with respect to the people involved now, wasn't very good. It was 4 companies put together, and the owners of the 4 companies were all on the board. So really it was a merger in name only. And it was going nowhere, and it was grossly overmanned and grossly inefficient. So my first attempt was, at that stage I was strong in finance, was to buy it. I bought options on 23% of the shares, and then lost my nerve and didn't proceed with the acquisition, because I think the government would have really come after me as an asset stripper and really given me all kinds of troubles. So actually that particular block of shares became the block that afterwards led to the acquisition by Pernod Ricard.
Okay.
Instead of that, I bought a closed alcohol plant on the Cooley Peninsula, one of 4 that had been owned by the state in very poor parts of the country, where there was blight on the potatoes. And they established these in the 30s to provide employment, and they decided that every gallon of petrol has to have 25% methanol. which was made from potatoes.
Okay.
Now, hopelessly inefficient. But the plant in Cooley had improved itself to the extent that it had changed to molasses, and the quality was very good. And it went to into things like Smirnoff vodka and Baileys at the time. So it did all right, but it was very inefficient. It lost money the whole time. The government closed the four of them one night in 1986, and I bought the plant at the end of 86.
Okay. And the Cooley Distillery then was sold to Jim Beam, I think 2011, 2012?
I was 15 years too early, and that we lost money for 11 years. Nobody wanted to know. We couldn't get distribution. Even if we got onto a shelf, we couldn't get off the shelf.
Yeah.
I built two distilleries on site. The key to Cooley, and indeed the key to Great Northern, is that 85% of all the whiskies in the world are blends of malts made in pots and grain whiskey made in columns. There are only 3 column distilleries in the country, and there was only one before I set up Cooley. And so I can provide blended whiskey. I can provide grain whiskey to make blended whiskey to the whole industry if necessary.
And this is the Great Northern now.
That's
this
Great
is your
Northern
capability now.
Yeah, whereas the boys, the distillery in Dublin, the Teeling distillery in Dublin, is pots only, so they make single malt,
okay,
peated malt, maybe pot still.
But and that Teeling's distillery in the Liberties, those are your sons, isn't that right?
The 2 sons. Well, the family has shareholdings in it, and my 2 sons and my daughter essentially control Great Northern as well.
Okay.
So their families. The boys, I hate to be called boys, the 2 men in there are developing. They're a branded strategy. Great Northern is a bulk strategy. It's quite different. But we'll end up, they're selling, Teeling after 4 years is selling in about 60 countries around the world. Great Northern will be supplying, still only about 14 or 16, but the companies we supply sell in at least that many countries around the world.
Okay, and in fact in the Teeling distillery there's a lovely visitor centre, isn't that right, where people can go?
That was a very interesting idea, and they got the timing right. When we rebuilt the Locke distillery in Kilbeggan and reopened it in 2007, there was a small visitor centre which we grew up over time to about 1,000 visitors a week, but it was hard work. And Jack and Stephen decided that they'd have a visitor centre, though the distillery is essentially to make whiskey for their brand. That's its purpose. They have a nice visitor centre and it's well designed, and they thought they would attract 1,000 visitors a week, 50,000 a year, whereas in fact now going into the 4th year, they were doing 3,000 a week. And if you went in there today, now at the end of June, July, it'll be very busy weekends. In fact, it's too busy now. So they do 700 a day on the weekends.
Yeah, in fact, I was looking at it recently for some friends, visitors from overseas, and it was full.
Yes.
It was full for weeks out.
And they're running every 25 minutes, every 20 minutes. They need the fact that it's full is a shock to them in a way, and so that they're having to revamp various things. They may not be able to grow that much further. And now there's more competition in the area because it has stimulated 3 other little distilleries in the area. Now that shouldn't surprise anybody.
Yeah, like a cluster, isn't it? It's a cluster effect.
There were 37 breweries and distilleries there in the 19th century.
This is it. Ireland was the whiskey powerhouse in those days, wasn't it?
60% of all of the world, and the 3 biggest distilleries in the whole world for everything were in the Liberties. Rowe, Jameson just across the river, and Powers at Thomas Street.
And what was it that lost that for us?
Inability to change technology. It's incredible. Disruptive technology. These columns I talked about, where you could make as much whiskey in 5 days as the small little rural distilleries could make in 90. But it came off the top of the pots, of the columns I should say, as 94.8% pure alcohol, and the Irish distiller said that's not whiskey. And they're right, of course, it's not whiskey, it's paint stripper, it's alcohol. It will kill you if you drink it. Yeah. And none of the 3 huge distilleries in Dublin ever put in pots this, or put in columns. This really drove me mad for a long time when I studied it in the States. I couldn't understand how they could be so silly as to not bring in new technology. They
were purists, I guess, were they?
No, they were stupid. Because if you examples you see now is Nokia, which led the world 60%, but couldn't adapt to the new technology. And I wonder very much what's going to happen with Ford, General Motors, with the autonomous cars. Will they be able to adapt culturally?
That's it.
And I suspect not.
Some of them won't. There will be casualties,
Yeah, they'll just be gone. And so I was unfair on the principals. They were looking at this and saying, but everything we know about whiskey for 8 generations says that this is not whiskey, so we can't do it. We won't be true to our to our ancestors, and they never did, and we went from 60% of the world to having 2% of Scotch. Unbelievable collapse. It was when I saw that collapse is why I decided I would look at the why of it, and then decided I could build a distillery. I couldn't be that bad.
Make the comeback. And Irish whiskey is now what, the fastest growing brown beverage in the world?
About 2000 things changed, and you should think about it, because young people just will not do what their parents did. And as you heard me mention, my boys, they hate to be called boys. Jack and Stephen say, hey, I'm not John Teeling, son, I'm Jack Teeling, I'm my own man.
Yeah.
And young Americans started to drink bourbon, and because it was sweeter, but they moved very quickly to Jameson, and they're now moving from Jameson to all the other Irish brands. Yeah. Because Irish is slightly sweeter and more mellow than bourbon, because again you're using more pot still in it. It will be more mellow. And now in 130 countries, Irish is growing at more than 10% a year.
It's amazing. Yeah, great success story.
It's time, and it's probably generational. From the areas that you and I had been talking about, the newer markets, there are separate markets there. You have the rich people who want to be international, and they tend to travel. This will be in Asia and maybe parts of South America. They will be older, in their 40s or 50s. And then you have the emerging young middle class in their 20s and 30s who want to be like all the people in the West. So two quite separate markets. One would be aged malts. The other one is probably entry-level whiskies. Mm-hmm. And you may have noticed Irish has been expanding its range of products very well. They're doing a very good job. Scotch may actually have the cultural dilemma I mentioned.
Yes.
Scotch blend is not a product of choice for young people anymore, and long may that last. I'm delighted with that.
So talking about Irish entrepreneurship, you're talking about your sons, or the boys as you call them. It's a new generation of Irish entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurship seems to be alive and well here since the recession. So where do you think the big opportunities are for us as a country with our entrepreneurship?
I think it's spectacular what has happened in if you take 40 years, because in the 70s, as you rightly said, entrepreneurship hardly existed, and if it did, people really looked at it bad. That was no fortune ever properly made, and there were real begrudges. Now, it's not a peculiarly Irish thing, but it was seen to be, and our background is not easy for a camel to get through the eye of a needle. Having that kind of codology. I don't know, and I'm sure your listeners don't know, that the eye of a needle is a small gate in the walls of Jerusalem. I didn't know that. Christian Brothers didn't tell me.
I didn't know that either.
No, exactly. So it has nothing to do with anything. It's a small gate. And so when a loaded camel came along, they had to remove the load. The camel could get through the wall. They had to bring their load through and put it back on the camel. That's the eye of the needle. See, so you've learned something. So it wasn't impossible. I learned that at a Jewish university in America.
There you go.
And I think there are opportunities. We have a very good primary education here. The 3 R's are very good, and in general, secondary education is very good. So the people are well educated. I learned not to like the highly specialised third level education when you're 17. I prefer the American system, the good schools where you do a lot more liberal arts and history of art and all that. You
become a much more well-rounded business person.
Also I think it trains your mind to look at differences.
Sure.
I think that as a rock in the North Atlantic, which is what we are, where anything heavy needs to be transported, where we have lots of disadvantages. I think the IDA have been brilliant over the last 40 years. I mean, you have to just take your hat off to them in that they played the game very, very well for having cheap labour. We have English-speaking labour. So for American companies coming to Ireland with technology, we have a huge advantage, which I think is grossly underplayed. In other words, you have a choice between coming here with a technology company or going to any of Eastern Europe or, say, Greece. Your manuals are in English. Irish people can read them.
Yeah.
Your supervisors can read them and can talk to them. To translate these into these other languages, one, you have to get translations, and two, you have to believe that translations are true. And so I think this is a big advantage, which is not labour related. I think our technology our technological universities have done well. So I think we will continue to be attractive that way. I think where we've got some fabulous spin-offs, the likes of Seamus Mulligan, who spun off from Milan, and earlier times there was a company, Digital Equipment in Galway, who went bust, and it spun off maybe 8 or 10 startups. And I again think we're very positive in Enterprise Ireland have done a very good job, but they're almost a one-stop shop. Now they can be bureaucratic as civil servants are, and it can take some time. And I'm sure people are saying, "Listen here, I spent 6 months trying to get approval from Enterprise Ireland." I understand that, and maybe worse than it was, when it was set up. Opportunities for us, I think, will be in areas that are education type related. I think they're going to be in the East. I have met some people recently who young Chinese man who came here and went to Griffith College, liked what they were doing, went back to his city in China. I can't remember, it only has 9 million people, so it's only a little city, and set up the Griffith College's equivalent, and then integrated backwards into private high school education because the Chinese system's not good, and he's 40-year-old billionaire now.
Yeah, amazing.
And sending a lot of people to Griffith and to UCC now as higher level students. So there'll be areas there that are slowly creeping up. I think that we have opportunities in the whole tourism sector, and more to grow. Now, it's hard to become a big world-class company at that stage, but the likes of the direct flights into Dublin, they've done a very good job there too. These 3 Chinese airlines flying are 3 sources, Hong Kong, Shenzhen and Beijing, into Dublin will have a big impact. You'll have Indians are arriving now, Thais are arriving now. These are people with big opportunities, and we've a lot to offer them. Agriculture, yes, because green is quality.
Yeah, agri-food.
That just has to continue to grow. There was a company here from Thailand last week, which was the biggest shrimp producer in the world. Our prawns and lobsters and things like that. I don't know what they'll do, but there's the possibility of a joint venture with them. I would imagine it's not for me. I was looking at other things with them. So I will be at the situation now. These are areas outside mine. I see more opportunities now than I ever did. My problem now is A, I'm older. B, I'm kind of busy. And so I haven't got as much time to look at the opportunities.
Something I noticed, when you look at Ireland's export figures in the aggregate, they look very impressive. But when you strip out the multinationals and look at the indigenous exporters, it's not so impressive outside of UK, US and near EU. We don't seem to diversify as much as our peers, say, the likes of Belgium and Denmark and Switzerland and so on. So what do you think is holding back our diversification?
I think that's a very significant point in that I'd be more gloomy than you. I think it's still largely UK, Northern Ireland and UK for the bulk of Irish companies who don't like to go too far from
What do you think's going on there?
I think culturally they're not able to do it. They don't have vision. They can't get their head up.
Yeah.
They just can't see.
So it's a confidence and competence thing, is it?
And the competence, who's going to do it, and they don't really want the dislocation factor. You would see if you were working in Germany and you're stuck in Frankfurt at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, you're missing the kids' party. That's the world we're in.
Yeah.
And you're going to have to do it. And as we go further abroad into Eastern Europe, into Asia, into South America, you're going to have to look at areas like this where the job is not 9 to 5. And the companies that many Irish companies are lifestyle companies.
Yeah.
The indigenous companies, they don't really want it. They want enough to make a living. The ones that want to grow, they do grow now. Some of them fail, and more will continue to fail. But I think you look at the ones that have some particular competence, and there aren't that many of those. I mean, one of the joys of Irish whiskey is it can only be made in Ireland, thank God. Because outside of that, there's the technology is not particularly difficult.
Yeah.
But it can only be made in Ireland. It has to be matured in Ireland for 3 years as well. So that gives us a point of difference. And you're going to have to play on those because unless you have a very rare skill and you're trying to compete on a big world, you're going to have local people, locals out there. And we don't have the actual venture capital to grow our companies that fast.
Yeah. Okay. And what we're seeing now, I'm seeing a lot with my clients, is a tightening labour market, particularly for frontline personnel in logistics, supply chain operations, which is my area, but I guess it's affecting all sectors. What do you think this tightening labour market is going to mean for us in the next few years?
I wonder how far it's gone. It's very strong in Dublin. It's obvious, and I would suspect it's up and down the East Coast. Not so sure about it. I've just spent a week around the country which I hadn't done for a long time. And there's certain parts of the country where the closed shops in the main streets are depressing.
Yeah.
And the labour wouldn't be as tight. Certainly, if you're in Dublin, you're in big trouble.
Yeah.
Particularly if you're trying to do early pays, like say the visitor centres. That's a big issue. In Dundalk, we have we don't have that many operatives because we're almost entirely automated, but still, and we've been lucky in the people, really lucky with the people we've wanted to get and have been able to get. I think it's going to, it'll certainly restrict growth. Definitely, because you won't have the people. Getting the type of people who are prepared to go and spend a year or 2 years abroad, which is what's needed. I think the European Orientation Programme, payback, EOP, the one that's run where you get young people for 18 months abroad, is a very good programme. Now, the negative is they are young, they are inexperienced. They wouldn't have the contacts.
Yeah.
And I have a lot of experience of it between Cooley. I know that Jack and Stephen have done it in Teeling. We've looked at it, where you take somebody really bright as a button, raring to go, full of energy and full of enthusiasm, willing to go out every night doing whiskey tastings. That sounds great maybe to a couple of you, but after the first 10 days it must be a pain in the neck. Yeah. And you're doing it every week. So they're great people, full of enthusiasm. Whether or not they have the skills, they're going to make mistakes, and you don't want them to make too many mistakes on your watch. So I think experienced personnel to go into the new markets will be increasingly tight and are very highly valued already. I'm sure you're seeing in logistics, the people who know how to handle cargoes around the world and areas like that are in tight supply and are costing a lot of money now.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. Well, what's your view on what's happening now? So we seem to be in a kind of a kickback against globalization, and I guess globalization is something we've profited from really well as a country. But Brexit, protectionism, rising nationalism, where do you see this whole thing going? Is it going to unravel, or is it just a blip?
It's not a blip. I don't think it's a blip at all. There's been a myth out there for a long number of times. Some of my initial work in the 60s as a student was on international trade theory. It's not at all certain that globalization overall is good. It's just not. Mm-hmm. The people who have been dominant for the last 40 years, if you look at the newspaper reporters, they assume ipso facto that globalization is good. Sure, it's good for some, but when you're doing a social cost benefit analysis, and the objective of economics is maximum welfare, not maximum profit, it's very hard for you to say that the millions and millions of people who've lost jobs as the jobs have moved across, that while some have benefited from it, their losses may be great. So there is a case to be made for tighter restrictions. There's no doubt about that. There always was. Mm-hmm. And that's what's happening now. What is happening in the US in terms of, and it's been played very well. If you were around in the 70s, the rising sun was the danger. Absolutely. China,
I remember,
Japan was wiping us all out. Yep. And then, of course, China has come in and eaten their lunch. And now what's happening, of course, Chinese costs are rising, and it's moving to India. Mm-hmm. And you can be I saw a presentation recently in the States. It was absolutely brilliant, where the guy was asking a huge American audience of 1,000 people, who, of course, most Americans are very parochial. They hardly see past their state, never mind they don't see anywhere else. Mm-hmm. And they were all, China was going to kill them, and Trump was right and all that. And he said, yeah, not at all. He says, your problem is coming down the road from India. Yeah. Because China's getting old and getting expensive. But which really upset them was, he said, what's it going to be in 2040? And they were looking at them. The people got India all right, some of the audience. Nobody got it. Africa. In Correct. 2040, which is only 20-odd years away. Yeah. There'll be 2 billion Africans. Yeah. And they are the ones with the money, and they're with the young people. And they will be taking this, at that stage, they'll be taking the textiles and the plastics and the metal bashing from the likes of India. And will be going to Africa. The Indians will be going mad. At that stage, China will be old. Yes. That's exactly what's going to happen. Yeah. So you have to compete with that, and you have to face that. So globalization, and in terms of nationalism, this will undoubtedly get me into, because I'm a kind of, go some of the way down the road. I'm very strong Irish, and a Gregor, and a believer in Irish culture. There is no doubt about it that over time bureaucracies take over, and what's been happening in places like Brussels, where unelected officials who pay themselves vast salaries and huge benefits and make rules that are predominantly in their own interest. Now, that's not to say we haven't benefited, but they are not necessarily what you want to see. What's happening in the States was going to happen anyway. The fact that 44% of people like what Trump is doing, it's nothing to do with Trump, they like what he's doing, shows that people are dissatisfied with what has gone on in Washington, and the politicians in Washington didn't see it. And in fact, I'm not so sure they still do. Mm-hmm. And I'm certain that the media doesn't. I am absolutely certain that the media doesn't see this at all. So things are cyclical. There is going to be changes certainly coming. I think a lot of the work done by the States, where they took on China and they took on Mexico and they took on Canada, will improve the lot of the US, definitely, because it was very one-sided, the trade. If you look at American trade with India has vast restrictions on American trade, and yet they've had free entry to the US. Trump says, why would we allow that? Again, I have to be extremely careful, because we here in Ireland shout and roar and object to Trump restricting immigration into Mexico, or from South America, and not so much Mexico, into the US, and yet we don't let anybody in.
Sure.
But I'm not allowed to say that.
There is a certain amount of double standards in those conversations.
Totally.
All right.
Yeah, we think all the Irish illegals should be made legal in America, but not the illegals in Ireland.
Sure.
Yeah. So but.
So outside of work, then, what kind of things do you like to do, John?
It's a very good question, because until I was in my 60s, I played cricket and rugby. Now, all right, from 62, when I stopped kind of junior league, I played golden oldies and I got hurt, and my brother, who's my GP, refused to have me stitched up and operated on, because he said if I cure him quick, he'd go back to playing. He was right. So I'm a bit at a loss. I don't sail, I don't play golf, and I don't do horses, which means I don't do the things my contemporaries do. I could do with having more active hobbies, definitely. Having even one. Now, I still follow rugby and I would still follow cricket, and I do it with my grandchildren. But I need more activities. I would spend far too much time working at my age, much too much time working. And even though my wife says I can retire at 95, you should talk to her, because that's exactly what she says. Yeah. The last thing she wants is me in the house. I don't think she'd live with me. One of us would be gone. I had thought of going back to college to do geography. I loved geography in UCD. I thought it was very good.
As did I. I was very, very, very keen on geography and history.
That explains maybe why you're international as well.
Yes, it does. It does. It's a lot to do with it. It's a lot to do with it.
And I have a sister who's just retired as a professor of medicine, and she's going back to UCD to do Latin and history, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, brilliant.
Good girl, her.
Brilliant.
And so I have many things. As I said, I have more opportunities than I want. I'm older. I'm not as fit as I was, because I'm not playing rugby. I got a bite in South Africa a couple of years ago, which led to a kind of a form of Lyme's disease, which was cured because it was found early, but still took about 2 years out of me. And these are my excuses. In other words, I'm saying I don't have hobbies.
Well, it looks like for the future you're going to be very, very active, whatever it is, whatever way you decide to go, whether it's more business or more learning.
But there's great opportunities, really great opportunities out there. I probably need more people working with me. And certainly the minerals have been a complete disaster for the last 8 or 9 years. We have a number of listed companies, and they're all in trouble. But we keep seeing light at the end of the tunnel. Nobody else does, but we do. And our straw's in the wind, but that's because our haystack is blown away. And so I'd hope to see one of those would go. The whiskey still has a long way to go, and it's very exciting for us. And that I think there's certainly 3 or 4 or 5 very active years, and hopefully I'm healthy enough to be able to do it, and then I can reassess.
Yeah, I'm sure you will be. And
yeah, thank you for your hope.
and look forward to talking to you more. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today, John. You wouldn't believe the time has flown by. We've been talking for over half an hour, I think, at this stage. So thank you very much for your perspective, and it's been an absolute pleasure. Many thanks, John.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Good luck.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Broadcasting to South Dublin on 93.9. This is Dublin South FM.